Hello, and welcome to the Mile and No-Till Field Day Wildlife Health Update for the summer of 2022. My name is Dan Grove. I'm the Wildlife Health Specialist for UT Extension, and I also serve as a wildlife veterinarian for TWA. I am housed within the Department of Forestry, Wildlife, and Fisheries within the University of Tennessee, but I am based out of the Nashville area, out of the Central Region Extension Office. So if you ever are in the Central Region, feel free to come by and stop by and say hello. Today, I'm going to cover two of the bigger diseases that are going on right now. Obviously, chronic wasting disease has been a problem since we discovered it in 2018 in Southwest Tennessee. But a new disease has popped up within our migratory waterfowl that also crosses over and impacts domestic poultry called avian influenza. So we'll briefly discuss what's going on with that across the country and here in Tennessee towards the end of this presentation. To get started with, just want to remind everybody what chronic wasting disease is. It is a prion, which is basically just an abnormal protein that gets into an animal and then changes the normal proteins within that animal to be the abnormal form. The body cannot get rid of these abnormal proteins, and they tend to build up and then start to cause problems within the body. What we see here on the slide is a bunch of pink material in this picture. This is actually a cross section of a white-tailed deer brain. All that pink material is a special stain for the abnormal protein. And you can kind of see within the pink material, there's clear areas where little holes and things. That's kind of the spongy appearance where the term transmissible spongiform encephalopathy came from. So when you look at an infected brain under a microscope, it actually looks like a cross section of a sponge. Anyways, you can imagine that as all this abnormal protein builds up in anywhere in the body, but especially in the brain and the spinal cord, it's going to end up leading to cell death, and that's what we start to see with these little holes. That's actually where brain cells used to be. The species that we're primarily concerned about here in Tennessee are going to be our white-tailed deer and elk. Elsewhere in the country, moose and mule deer have also been shown to be infected in the wild. And then elsewhere in the world, caribou have naturally been infected in the wild. Most cervid species, though, are susceptible to chronic wasting disease or to infection with this particular prion disease, but not all. But most species that have been looked at have been shown to be susceptible when it comes to species that are related to deer, elk, and moose. Pretty much whenever you look at it, the prions can be found in almost every tissue and every secretion that comes out of the body. So saliva, nasal secretions, urine, feces, all those kind of things. Some level of prion has been found in all those secretions, as well as every tissue and blood and semen and muscle tissue and things like that. It's also been found in. Although the areas where it builds up in the highest concentration tends to be the lymphatic system, so the lymph nodes, and also in the brain. It is 100% fatal. There's never been a deer or moose or an elk that has been demonstrated to actually survive infection. Again, because the damage is occurring in the brain, typically damage to the brain is irreversible. And so once these build up to the level where you can actually start to see clinical signs, those things that we can actually visually observe, usually you've got the animal is pretty well close to death. There is no treatment. There is no vaccine available. Transmission can be direct, so from animal to animal, or indirect. We know that the transmission can occur once prions build up in the environment because they are extremely resistant to natural degradation in the environment. That these prions will remain infectious once they leave the animal host. Now, they aren't reproducing in the environment because they're not a living organism. They do need a host in order to be able to be reproduced, but once deposited in the environment, they can continue to build up and remain infectious in the environment. As mentioned, they're extremely difficult to destroy. The natural mechanisms of just heat, sunlight, freezing, those kind of things, drying out, they don't destroy prions. Chemical denaturing using extremely harsh chemicals or heat greater than 1,000 degrees Celsius or roughly 1,838 degrees Fahrenheit are known to actually destroy these prions. So in terms of clinical science, again, those things that we can actually view, here's some pictures of what people typically consider to be a suspect animal for chronic wasting disease. On the left, we've got an animal abnormal location. You can kind of see the rib cage and the spine, and almost every single one of its bones are kind of outlined. And the animal in the center has got what we call airplane ears. She's looking at you. She's aware that you're there, but she's not really reacting. Her ears aren't up and perked and, like they normally do. She's not moving her ears around at all. She's just kind of like they're just hanging low. That's kind of one of the classic signs of chronic wasting disease. And then the animal on the far right is an animal towards the end stages of the disease. It may take upwards of 12 to 18 months before we start to see any of these clinical signs that we're talking about here on this slide. But again, because the disease takes a while to build up in the animal. Of course, during that 12 to 18 month period, they actually are shedding the prion into the environment. So you have normally healthy looking animals potentially actually spreading the disease. And so we typically, most of our surveillance that we do is through hunter harvested animals. And most of the time, the animals that test positive are actually clinically looking, clinically normal looking animals. So what we see here is an animal that was harvested in Wisconsin in roughly 2011 on the left-hand side. It's basically a big, big buck, nice thick neck, nice antlers, and just a good, healthy looking animal. That animal tested positive for chronic wasting disease. The same thing on the right. In 2018, this animal was harvested off of one of our wildlife management areas in Southwest Tennessee. And again, you see a nice, big, healthy looking animal with a nice thick neck, what you would expect to see during rut, and good amount of antler points, just nice thick beams. What we would all consider a normal animal actually tested positive for the disease. So we highlight these things basically to show the importance that clinical signs alone do not indicate disease, because the animal could be diseased long before you ever see those clinical signs. And those clinical signs match up with a bunch of other diseases. The only way we can actually know if an animal has the disease is to actually take samples from it and test. People want to know, can I get this? Is it zoonotic? Meaning, does it transfer from the animal to humans? The jury's still out. There's been multiple studies using different animal models that have conflicting results. We do know that there are other prions from other species of animals, including people, that will actually be transmissible to people. And one of those you might have heard of is mad cow disease. And there's also genetic forms of the disease that exist in people. And then it's also been known to be transmitted via contaminated surgical instruments and things like that. If surgery is done on a sick individual and they're not sterilized properly and then used on another individual, there has been documentation that the disease can be transmitted that way in people. Again, that's just the human side of the disease. It is not chronic wasting disease itself has never been demonstrated to cross over and to infect people. There's been a lot of people that have been knowingly and unknowingly exposed to the disease through consumption or through even handling animals. And to date, there has not been a known case of disease in people as a result of coming in contact with prions from chronic wasting disease. We do, however, urge caution. If you are hunting in an area that is known to have CWD, we recommend that you get your animal tested and that if it tests positive, that you do not consume it from that animal. So this is a little outdated, but it gives a good timeline of basically how chronic wasting disease developed, the information that we know about it, and where basically was first found and how it spread. It was first found out west in the late 60s. It wasn't known what was actually causing the disease at that point. It wasn't known to be a prion that was causing the disease until actually the early 80s. But since then, the disease has been detected in the United States and Canada, as well as in Scandinavia, and it was translocated to South Korea via captive cervid movements. This is what the map of CWD looks like in the country right now. The darker gray areas out west are where it was first known to exist before 2000. The light gray areas are at the county level, where the disease is known to exist in wild animals. The red and yellow dots correspond to captive cervid facilities. The yellow dots are ones where the disease was found and those facilities were depopulated. The red dots are recent or currently known facilities that have CWD in them, and there's still deer that exist in those. And as we kind of narrow in, as you can see on this map, there's a little dot in a county in North Carolina, and then there's a little dot in northern Alabama. Those are the two most recent findings of CWD. Those two states just found that disease this last hunting season through their hunter harvested surveillance. And we kind of narrow down to our region here in Tennessee and our associated states where we have it in West Tennessee at least. This is kind of where the way it looks at the county level. So the disease here is primarily in Fayette and Hardin County, where we have the most positives, but we have found either individual or clusters of positives in the counties surrounding Fayette and Hardin County all the way up to Henry County. And you can see that the area actually extends down to Mississippi, so it is a cross-border issue at this point. Again, here's what it kind of looks like and how we've classified things here in Tennessee. The red counties being where positives have been found in wild deer, and then the yellow counties are considered high-risk counties, and they fall within 10 miles of a known positive in the wild. So basically, we just draw a circle around the geographic location of where an individual was found. If it crosses over into another county, that county is then designated as high risk. And that's more for regulatory purposes than anything. In general, we don't know what a deer's actual home range is, so we don't know where it was found. So we use a 10-mile buffer to kind of, it could have been anywhere, lived anywhere within that 10 miles after it was found. So this kind of gives you an idea of what the surveillance has looked like. On the left-hand side is the number of animals that were sampled year on the bottom of the slide. And so back in 2002, roughly, is when Wisconsin found CWD. It was the first time it was found east of the Mississippi River. So everyone started wondering, hey, do we actually have it? Because we have not been testing very well. And so a lot of states throughout the country actually increased their surveillance for multiple years whenever there's federal funding available. But, you know, after not having found anything, a lot of states, the further they were away from known positive states, just didn't emphasize as much for testing because it wasn't thought to exist there. In 2015, though, Arkansas detected CWD here in Tennessee, which started a whole series of events where Tennessee, we basically started looking at, well, what's our capacity for doing testing? And then we did a risk assessment. And then same year we're doing the risk assessment, Mississippi actually had their first known detection. And then after we instituted our new weight-based surveillance program in 2018-19 hunting season, we actually detected CWD for the first time in Fayette, Hardin, and Madison counties. And then you can see that the sampling ramped up in the next 3 years since we've actually detected the disease. The majority of those samples, although we're doing sampling statewide, greater than 80% of the samples that we collect in a given year come from regional or West Tennessee counties. But we do our surveillance year round. We actually do what we call targeted surveillance for any animal with clinical signs consistent with CWD. We try and get out there and take samples from it. If we can get our hands safely on roadkill, we'll take samples from those. Or if animals are dying from other causes, like if we have hemorrhagic disease outbreaks, depredation permits are issued to folks that are when deer causing problems with crops and things like that. We'll try and get samples out of as many deer as we can in the non-hunting seasons. During hunting season, though, is definitely where the bulk of the samples come from. We use check stations across the across the state, typically on opening weekends in the portions of the state that are not known to have CWD, but definitely all the way throughout the season via voluntary drop-off taxidermists and processors in West Tennessee, where we're known to have the disease. This map gives you an idea of how we do our surveillance. We actually do it at the county level. There's 95 counties in Tennessee. A risk assessment has been done for each county. And a number of points has been assigned to each county where biologists have to go out and get X number of deer that correspond to the number of points. The points basically are different based on the likelihood that the animal is going to have CWD in an early detection scheme. So we're more likely to find it in bucks first, adult bucks, and then in adult does and yearling bucks second. So the points are basically weighted greater towards bucks. They're worth more points in our sampling scheme. And that's not to say they're more or less susceptible to disease. It's just buck behavior lends to them being more likely to come in contact with an infected animal because they come across more animals in their normal social activities throughout the course of the year. So they are more likely to come into contact with a sick animal, and they're more likely to actually spread the disease because of the number of animals that they're. But all animals are relatively speaking equally susceptible to the disease. This kind of gives you an idea in West Tennessee of how our sampling scheme works. We've got our freezer drop-off locations indicated by like the little snowflake, and then we've got processors and taxidermists that we utilize. And just kind of give you an idea, there's a lot of opportunity for sampling in West Tennessee. And then you can always just take it to a regional office too as well if you can't get to one of these places. Because there's always a freezer drop-off at the regional office in Jackson too. So a lot of people get confused. They think that the disease is exploding out west. The reality is it takes you about 5 years to kind of figure out what's going on. So our first detection was in 2018. I had about 185 animals that tested positive in Fayette, Harlan, and Madison counties. And in December of 2019, that represents the 2019-20 season. Hunting season, we actually changed our surveillance scheme to look closer at the counties surrounding Fayette and Hardeman because we knew it existed in Fayette and Hardeman. And so really what you're seeing here is an artifact of enhanced surveillance to try and narrow down exactly where the disease exists in our state. So after 4 good surveillance seasons and roughly 36 months since the original detection, this is kind of where we're sitting, where we know that there's about 60% of our samples that test positive come from along 500 to 600 square mile area on the Fayette and Hardeman County borders. And then as you go out, there's less and less detections of the disease. So when we talk about prevalence is the number of animals on the landscape that actually have the disease out of a set number. So if we talk about like a 10% prevalence, that means if I go out and randomly sample 100 animals, then 10 of those animals will test positive for the disease. And so like if we look at Hardeman and Fayette County, if I go out and randomly across the county sample 100 animals, roughly 11.8% of those, or 11 to 12 of those animals will actually test positive for the disease. And roughly 17 to 18 of that same 100 animals that I collected in Fayette would actually test positive for the disease. And so management schemes are going to vary based on the percent prevalence that actually exists within a county. So lower prevalences, there's going to be different management tools that work more effectively, and at higher prevalences, there's going to be different tools that work. Although all may be employed in a county in terms of management opportunities for the hunting public as well as for private landowners. Some things like targeted removal and things like that, those tend to be more effective in lower prevalence areas in the periphery because the disease isn't spread out geographically over such a large area. So this is kind of a combined, if you combine Fayette and Hardeman counties, our prevalence is increasing in those counties. There's a statistically significant increase from 2018 to 2021 in those counties. We're also seeing an increase by age and sex distribution. Again, again, the cores that are being fed in Hardin County. So we are seeing it in our fawns, which means that they're probably, because fawns in this scheme are through hunter harvest typically, that means they're being infected early on in life. So they're probably being either infected during whenever they're in the womb or shortly thereafter, if the doe is infected. And we're seeing about a 1 in 5 males test positive for the disease in those two counties, which is a pretty high prevalence to have in a given sex and age class. So the best practice that we recommend, not to artificially congregate wildlife in a particular area. So we've been feeding, like some baiting. There are carcass transport restrictions, because remember, those preos are still infectious even if that animal is dead. I would recommend responsible carcass disposal. Use PPE, basically gloves, mask if you're immune compromised. Try and wash off anything that you get on you whenever you're cleaning the animal out. We're conducting surveillance, and we've increased our management strategies. We've got the Earn-a-Buck program. Just this year, it has changed. CWD hunters can enter additional buck by harvesting one antler this year and submitting it for CWD testing. The replacement buck applies anywhere. So anywhere in the state, if you harvest a positive animal, then you can actually get another buck added to your bag limit because that animal tested positive. You're allowed to keep your trophy. You're just not allowed to move that trophy out of the zone until it's actually been mounted or appropriately cleaned. We do have the Fight CWD incentive program, where if you harvest a positive animal, you can get a $75 processing voucher for each positive. This last year, we had 630 positive animals, so 630 were actually issued, but only 71 were redeemed. So essentially, you have to redeem those at a participating processor. But what that does is that means you're not getting your processing fees, and roughly it's about the base cuts on processing are roughly $75. And if you harvest 2 positives, you actually can get an annual sportsman's license. There are CWD management permits available for landowners in all of Fayette and Hardin County, and anyone within 3 miles of additional positive locations outside of those 2 counties, and then allows for take of deer outside of the season. Typically, those permits are not issued until after the season. You can apply for those prior to the season ending, which we actually highly encourage, because then there's not a rush at the end. But you can apply for those permits if you live within 3 miles of a known positive. Just contact your local TWA county officer, and they should be able to help you out and let you know if you're within the area that qualifies for getting permits for taking animals out of season. Other programs that are in conjunction with private landowners, we do targeted removal. Again, those areas that are kind of out in the periphery where there's just one positive. We try and focus in and remove additional animals to get an idea of what the prevalence is around that one positive, as well as potentially remove that individual family unit that animal came from, because those are likely to be the animals that are affected in the area. Again, that's 100% with landowner permission. It's conducted by USDA Wildlife Services. The first year that we did this, in 2021, about 4,000 pounds of venison was donated after the animals were tested and determined not to have CWD. About 4,000 pounds of venison was donated to local food pantries and programs. Currently, we're in a 5-year plan for CWD programs. We're looking to basically have a 5-year strategic plan in the early stages of writing. Hopefully, by the end of this year, we'll actually have a full plan approved by the commission. There will be time probably later this summer or early this fall for public input that will be rolled out for public options and input on. In terms of research projects, we do have a couple that are going on. One, we use dogs as biosensors for detecting CWD infection. We're about 90% accuracy for getting dogs to be able to detect animals that are infected with the disease just by smelling the feces, and we're or moved on to gut piles. Hopefully we'll actually be moving on to more field applicable options this fall. So if you see some dogs at a check station out west, those potentially could be some of our research dogs that we're using to look at to see if we can use them to detect CWD in animals for us. We're also looking at the basically accumulation of prions in the environment and mitigation techniques so that we could potentially offer recommendations to private landowners of how to get rid of prions on their property. So that work is in progress also. For more information and more up-to-date information, this was recorded in June of 2022, so some things may change by hunting season. But I always encourage you to visit the Timber website. It has the most accurate information, or call your regional office or your local law enforcement officer if you have additional questions. But there's on the screen here are options for additional information regarding CWD. And quickly, I'll just mention avian influenza is primarily a disease that's classified by its ability to kill domestic poultry. Domestic poultry being our chickens and turkeys. This year there is outbreaks going on all across the country. On the slide here, basically we're looking at about over 40 million birds that have been impacted. Again, this is domestic poultry. The disease is spread via waterfowl. Typically, wild animals are not impacted by it. This year, however, we have found detections in many states. Many of these animals are actually being clinically affected, so actually being negatively impacted by the disease. Eagles are seen for some reason to be highly susceptible this year. Black vultures, there's been a lot of documented die-offs. Wood ducks, geese, and shorebirds have also had detections in them. In terms of for right now, we're in the monitoring phases of this. In the summertime, it is kind of cyclical. The disease kind of drops off because the water temperatures are not adequate to help the cycle of the disease. With the cooler temps though and migration this fall, we expect to see another wave of avian influenza come across. If you're out hunting and harvesting animals, we recommend that you visit either the CDC website or the USDA website listed here for additional advisories. The TWA website will be updated on the waterfowl hunting page also. Current recommendations are to handle with gloves. If you have backyard poultry, make sure that you're not cross-contaminating. Don't bring carcasses and things like that to your house. Just take every precaution you can not to cross-contaminate your flock with remnants from hunter harvested animals. Change your boots out, things like that are what we're currently recommending. There is a slim chance that this could be infectious to people. It's more been documented in people directly working with poultry in poultry houses, so with really close contact. But we always advise caution. So again, highly recommend you visit the CDC website listed here or the USDA website for more information as this disease progresses and evolves over the summertime. With that, if you have any questions, feel free to contact me. The best way is usually via email. My email is dgrove@utk.edu. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to hearing from any questions.